Welcome back in, everybody, to another edition of Coach's Corner here on the Auburn Undercover Podcast. I'm Nathan King, joined by former Auburn defensive coordinator Ellis Johnson. Ronnie Sanders, our publisher, has rejoined us this week. And Ellis, a lot to get into today, but first off, the last time we did this, we didn't record last week. We were looking forward to the start of the season, and Auburn, it only took a couple games for them to start scrambling for answers a little bit on offense. I guess I'll just open the floor up to you to go ahead and get started. What were your impressions of kind of what went wrong for them in that Cal game and what they can maybe do moving forward?
I was really surprised because after the first game, I thought one of the main things that had been talked about in the offseason was Coach Freeze sort of taking back over the offense, made a change at coordinator, brought in Derek, somebody who was more familiar with the way he did things, and it looked like he's taken over the play calling. And I understand they didn't play a really good football team the first game, but it still looked like they were much more in sync, sort of looked like Hugh had a complete control of what he wanted that offense to be. Apparently they didn't get tested very well physically because when they did, some things have shown up. But, you talk about Cal, I think Wilcox is a heck of a coach, and he's a really good defensive coach. And he doesn't have that great a winning percentage. If you look at his record, it's what's so special or whatever. But he's had some big wins over there, and we all know that Cal doesn't put the emphasis in the facilities and other things that a lot of those other schools do, and he's done a great job there. I had a real good friend who played at Arkansas, and his son signed with and played at Cal, and he will go out there and watch practice, and he knew football. And he said he was really impressed with Wilcox. So obviously they did a good job. And, I think about the other game last year and how close it was out there. And Auburn was fortunate to win. So, Cal comes in. It's tough playing in that stadium, but they came in knowing they could play with Auburn. They'd done it before. And they made enough big plays to win the game. Now, the biggest question, of course, is what about the quarterback, and is he the guy, and it was just one bad day, or is this a continuation from what's been going on? You got to trust Hugh's judgment on picking quarterbacks and coaching them and training them and developing them. But right now that thing's hit a snag, and I don't know if they've got another young guy or anybody else that's been sort of in the picture, but another outing like that, and they're going to have to look at trying to do something else, I guess.
That's what I was going to ask you. How long do you stick with, especially a veteran quarterback? How long do you stick with a guy who's struggling? Especially
that's a great question. I mean, it hinges on a lot of factors, and not all of them just the quarterback. They're in there probably looking to see whether people around him played poorly, were the routes not run correctly, where they broke off too short, did somebody completely bust the route, was the protection breaking down and keeping him from being able to settle in the pocket. I didn't see the whole game, so I can't answer those questions. The other thing is, who else do you have? And you have to make that judgment. He may be doing a lot of things also other than just the physical aspects of the game. He may be one of the team leaders in that locker room, and you got to be really careful. If you, I think that Kentucky's facing a similar situation. So is Florida. They quarterbacks, their starters didn't play real well, but they were older guys who've stuck with the program and been around there, and they may be leaders or whatever. But the younger guys that got their chance came in and did a better job, especially Florida, that one. So I don't know who else he has and how far he takes this or how long he waits. You can't wait too much longer if it doesn't improve. And last year, it wasn't drastic changes, but last year he'd show flashes of improvement and then it would backtrack, and flashes of improvement and it would backtrack. And this year, of course, that's the way it started off right now. So if it doesn't turn and get better soon, I would think you got to go to somebody else.
What about to me? And I was at the game. I took my 12-year-old, and to me, sitting in the stands, it looked like some things kind of stuck out to me. I mean, I knew a couple of coaches at Michigan State when Thorne transferred to Auburn, and one guy told me in particular, he said he's good if he gets protection. If he doesn't, he gets happy feet and starts throwing interceptions. And it looked like to me he made some bad decisions, but it looked like to me that he also didn't have a lot of protection.
Yeah,
that was,
that's I was sort of alluding to that. The snaps that I saw, he wasn't under great duress, but I could tell he wasn't settled in. And I was actually looking at later in the game because when I saw the score, I flipped over to try to catch the end of it. And, it just, you could tell he was off key. And even when he has protection, sometimes if you're not getting protection and it happens 2 or 3 times early in the game, some kids can't shake that. And you get everything straightened out up front, or either a running back missing pickups or something like that. You get it all cleaned up. And the rest of the game, he's protected pretty well, but he's already lost his calm and he's already lost his poise. So I don't know. It's hard to speculate when you're not in the room coaching and observing and grading the films and all that and getting a little more detailed picture on it. But it's obviously not a performance that they can keep going with. If they do, they're not going, they won't win 6 ball games and get to a bowl game. So it's not just that it was disappointing, it's concern. And again, I don't know who else they've got, and I don't know if this is something that will continue. So I don't think there's any way that they abandon it right now. I think they're probably trying to clean it up and get better. They didn't run the ball too bad statistically. Maybe they were behind and didn't feel comfortable trying to run the football, but they ran it okay. And they were struggling more with protection than they were with blocking the fronts on the run. So, I don't know. Sometimes you're not involved in the game plan. You don't understand the play calls, but there's a good reason for them.
Yeah, Free said, I can't remember what their average was, 5.7 yards per carry, something like that. They're backed up a lot. I think their third quarter drive started from the 2, and the 10. So I think he was sort of keen to get them out of there pretty quickly. Ellis, I wanted to ask you something I've been personally thinking about the last couple of days. From a defensive or offensive perspective, whatever. They've got this RPO scheme that they honed in on with Freeze. It's been his thing, for a long time. Last year, it seemed really clunky. It's just, to me, that scheme just seems like really high degree of difficulty. It's got kind of a long checklist. You have to have a quarterback that can make the throw on time. You have to have a quarterback that can make the right read. You have to have the receivers that can run seems like there's a lot of stuff going on. Is it at all possible? Let's say they go with Hank Brown, the backup, and let's say he needs to not run that RPO so much. Is it possible for a coaching staff to make that much of a scheme change in a season, even if it's just slight alterations, or are you kind of stuck with what you've been working on all offseason? I guess from your perspective, what do you think about that?
I think you could change, but again, you hit the most important thing with the very first lead in, and that is that the players fit what they're trying to do. And obviously he's had tremendous success over the years with that approach. But if you don't have the right guys in the right places, it just doesn't work. I hate to keep using analogies, but DJ Ungale was a tremendous sign for Clemson when they got him. And he's not good at those things. His delivery, he doesn't have the quick release, the ability to come off the ride. Sometimes throwing the RPOs is not the best way to measure a quarterback's mechanics, in the pure pocket throwing aspects. And some guys may be good pro quarterbacks. I couldn't imagine Tom Brady running an RPO. But, some guys can pull that ball out and flick it and get it in there real quickly, and some can't. You'll see one team run an RPO with a hitch screen outside that's hot, and the guy will make the correct read and throw it out there. And the next thing you know, DB's hitting the guy before he can get out of his tracks. And it doesn't look that different from the teams that were successful, but what's going on is the delivery is about a half a second to a second late. And that sounds like, well, hell, what difference is that going to make? It makes all the difference, when you're talking about Power 5 athletes and how quick they are. So if you can't get the ball out and accurately throw it to the option, the pass option, then it's not a big threat. And people will sit back and pack the box and take away your run portion on it and just make you throw it almost every time. If you get the read to throw it, you got to throw it. So I don't know how good they are up front. But, you can just take the run pass option off of it and just run the football, without the read on it. And I don't think their quarterbacks are great ball carriers. So they don't have the option of pulling it or keeping it. And it does make you have to go back, control the line of scrimmage. And You can't control the line of scrimmage. You have to have those RPOs, to try to get people out of the box and decrease the numbers that you got to block because your linemen are not good enough to control the box. So again, I don't know their depth chart well enough and can't make that determination, but they're not getting the production on it. I don't know if it's necessary the scheme that they're running or if it's just the players don't fit the scheme.
Let me ask you, Auburn opened with Alabama A&M, a really, really bad FCS opponent. 72-3 game. Is that a good idea to open with a team like that, or had you rather open with a Group of 5 program that's a little bit better, or maybe a better FCS opponent?
Maybe Cal in the first game.
I just personal opinion. I would rather open with a 1AA opponent or a really, really top notch, like a Clemson Georgia game. The opener with the teams like two top 10 teams possibly. I think it gives you great preparation in the off season. Kids are excited about it, a little more focused and intense with their workouts and their little sessions and all that kind of thing. If you got a weak opponent at the beginning, kids may not have that level of excitement in the preseason when you need them to kind of grit through the practices. I don't know, but I would much rather, if you had to pick, I don't like playing one of the Group of 5 teams or a mid-level Power 4 team as an opener, someone who could beat you, but you're supposed to beat them. That's when the negativism really starts piling up on you, is when you lose a game that you go into favored by 10 or 20 points, and then you lose that game, and it really, puts a damper on your whole season. And coaches, obviously, that's what they get paid to fix, but it's a lot easier fixing the X and O's than it is fixing the frustration and the mental part of your team.
Does it make sense for a program like Auburn to play a Cal on the West Coast, or does it make more sense to pick up if you're going to play that kind of a game? Does it make more sense to pick up a Duke or a Wake Forest? I
personally don't like traveling across the country to play any game, unless it's a bowl game, or perhaps you're one of these big time kickoff games at the beginning of the year, and you get to play it early, get a couple of extra days to come in and report. It isn't bad to have an open date right after them too. When it's been proven, I think Major League Baseball has done the study, and of course they travel as much as anybody, if not more. I don't know about the NBA, but they travel as much as anybody. And teams that traveled across the country, and especially from west to east with that time change, the percentages of losing was noticeably higher with the team that traveled. And it wasn't quite as bad going to the West Coast. But see, what happens when you go to the West Coast, you don't lose time. You don't have to get up earlier, 4 hours earlier than you usually do, and be ready to play. And the biological clock doesn't kick in. But when you travel back home or back over to the other side of the country to play the next game, that's when it kicks in. So I don't know if that affects football quite as much because they play once a week and not 4 or 5, 6 times a week. But I never have liked that. If I was coaching at Florida State, I would have tried to find out who in the hell scheduled the opening game in Ireland against a decent football team and have his ass fired instead of me. I don't get all that. I understand they're trying to grow the game, but it could be devastating to your program.
Well, Notre Dame got a big win, then turned around and dropped Northern Illinois this week.
Yeah, again, it's very similar to the Auburn game. I was very surprised. After I watched Notre Dame and LSU, and I knew they didn't have wasn't a great team or a perfect team, but I looked at the physicality of the game and I thought these guys might be in the picture at the end. I definitely thought they might be one of the 12 teams, and they looked like they're physical enough on defense and both sides of the ball that they'd be a team to be reckoned with. Now, Riley Leonard, the quarterback they got from Duke, he didn't play that well the first game either, and they just overcame it with tremendous defense and some turnovers and other things. But he's had 2 games where he hasn't played nearly as well as he's going to have to play. They're going to end up winning about 7 or 8 games.
And they have a pretty weak schedule as well.
Yep.
I mean, it's not like they play a tough schedule. I know we're jumping around a little bit, but I like to get I like to jump around the conference. What in the hell's going on in Florida?
Ronnie, I don't know. I told somebody the other day, everybody's Florida this, Florida that, Florida this, Florida that. If you look back through Florida's entire history, it's very spotty, other than two tenures, Steve Spurrier and Urban Meyer. And a lot of folks claim, and I'm not piling on this issue, but they said there were a lot of problems off the field that ended up really damaging the program when Urban was there, and it ended on a bad note. But I mean, and of course I've worked for him, so I'm partial. But Steve Spurrier is that good. I mean, if you look at what he did at South Carolina, and look at the history of that program, and you look at what he did at Florida. Now, they've had some good teams in the past, and they've had some great teams over history, but they have never had consecutive dominance in that program in the whole history of the program, except with Steve Spurrier and for almost as long Urban Meyer. So everybody's in shock at the fact that they can't just rebound every time they get down. And I don't know what it is. They've certainly got a recruiting demographic, and they've got players to choose from. And I think Billy knows what he's doing. I mean, I've known him since he was a quarterback at Furman, and I coached against him. I think he's a heck of a football coach, very knowledgeable, knows what he's doing and so forth. I just don't know. Sometimes you make a decision about a coaching staff coming in the door, and you have 2 or 3 things that don't fit well. They may all be great coaches, but it just doesn't jive. You come into a situation that needs immediate shot in the arm, because there's a lot of morale and locker room things supposedly going on with the team he inherited. And I know for a fact there were some issues with that. But it's hard to take over a program these days that's down unless you get an immediate infusion of success. Everybody jumps off the train, and then it gets even harder to try to turn it around. So I don't know. Now, they've got a quarterback thing like similar we were talking about a while ago. If Lagway's for real, now they didn't play a great opponent, so we got to put the brakes on a little bit. But if that kid's the best player, now he's got another hard decision, because I think his quarterback Mertz is a team leader, and that's been said by different sources. So I think that's accurate, and he really is a big part of the glue in the locker room. So all of a sudden you put your starter, who's team leader, on the bench because the other kid can make plays. But if it reaches a point that he can do it, I think you got to make that change. So we'll see. But I don't have an answer for what's wrong. I just know that it's very hard to turn it when it gets in that situation. And I think he inherited some tough situations.
Yeah, I think
Nathan, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I mean, having spent 3 years there, once they get on you, it's it's hard to turn it. I think you make a really good point, and I'm biased, but Ron Zook always says, he said, "Hell, I stocked the cupboard twice, and that's the only time they've ever won."
And they, it gets that way everywhere. Once you've been good, and people taste it, and they think that's what this program is, and then it doesn't happen with the next guy, and it goes negative in a hurry. I mean, Dan was a part of such great programs when he was there with Urban, and then he went somewhere else and did it himself at a tougher place, Mississippi State. He goes back, and it doesn't really work that well. And so he got a little more, I think he got a little longer leash, but it wasn't in good shape when he left. And I think, that's part of what Billy inherited. And I think in some ways people go into Florida, and you don't think you got to do a blue collar job for a couple of years. But when it's down like that, you got to do a blue collar job. You're just not going to have people begging to come in there and jump on, for no reason. I go back to the controversial thing that happened with the quarterback 2 years ago with the portal. NIL, excuse me. And that was just, those kind of things hurt you in more ways than just losing one player. It affects a lot of stuff. And Nobody would let that die. And that was a huge distraction around there for months and months. And it just gets everybody in a negative vibe. And just like what we're doing now, with all the social media and all the media attention and everything, you get that kind of stuff going around a program, and it's hard to dig out.
Ellis, we talked about Notre Dame for a minute. I think Hugh Freeze talked about it yesterday. A lot of really good teams played badly on Saturday. I mean, Alabama ended up pulling away, but they were in a dogfight with USF at home for more than 3 quarters. I think maybe something Auburn might try to latch onto here is the fact that this performance against Cal came so early in the season. And clearly in college football, as you know better than anybody, having coached probably thousands of these kids, things can change in a big way from week to week when you're coaching kids. I guess, is that something that maybe if you're a coaching staff gives you a little bit of hope that, hey, you get it out of the way early rather than, oh, it's week 10, you just went to Kentucky or whoever they play late in the year and only scored like 3 points? I mean, does that maybe help you a little bit that you got this performance out of the way so early?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think if you're going to have a game where you spill all your groceries on the floor, you want it to happen early, and you want to overcome it too. You don't want to end up like Notre Dame and it doesn't turn out okay on the scoreboard. Alabama, if you think back, it's the exact time last year. I mean, they're playing like that against South Florida last year. Remember, he benched Milroe, and everybody was wondering, when's he going to put him back in? When's he going to put him back in? We're getting ready to get our rear ends kicked, and he won't put Milroe back in. Well, he didn't put him back in, and it woke the kid up a little bit too. I think if you look at how he's played in the last 12 games since he benched him down there, but they played poorly against South Florida last year, and it's 2 different coaches, 2 different systems, and a lot of different players, but same situation. I think sometimes you got to talk about South Florida. Got a pretty good football team. They're not winning a lot of big-time games and championships and so forth because they just don't have those players that can do that yet. But you can't play badly against a team like South Florida and still win. So it was a good job, I guess, of staying alive and getting the win, coming out of it without completely falling apart. But that can be a positive for a team as well as a learning situation and seeing the right things on film. And maybe you find a lot out about your players too. You find out 2 or 3 of them, you can't trust them in a tough game, in a tight game. They put them on the bench and let somebody else play.
I said, now you've been at Alabama when it turned negative, and bringing in a guy from the outside, from the West Coast, like Kalen DeBoer. What happens if Alabama, and I figure they will, looking at the schedule's a little bit tougher this year than in the past. What happens when Alabama loses 2 or 3 games? How quickly is that going to turn negative?
Yeah, if they lose that many, it'll be a lot of what we've just been talking about, negative vibrations all over the place. And I mean, it just makes that job that much harder to try to, keep the kids focused and moving forward. I think the first game, although again, they didn't play a real good football team, but it looked like they had made the transition without any issues. If you saw a game like they played last week, you'd think it might have happened the first game. Kids not really on the same page and that type of thing. But really, I think it goes to the level of competition. Who did they play the first game? Who did they play the second game? And just like Auburn, it wouldn't drive me crazy or I wouldn't lose sleep at night just because of those 2 games coming out the way they did. I would be losing sleep about my quarterback. And we've already talked about Peyton. And now if you look at Milroe, I mean, I don't know if he had 10 yards rushing. And if there's one thing he usually does is just kill teams, is either scrambling or on some quarterback design runs. He might put 70 yards on you in a game. And the critical plays too, big 3rd down runs and those type things. For some reason, they either had a good scheme against him to bottle up that kind of stuff, or either he just didn't see the times where he needed to take off and make those plays for him. But he was very average, and that's not a good sign. He's too experienced now. He wasn't last year, but he's too experienced now to be having games like that. So you play another good defensive football team and they get him off key, that I don't know if they can overcome that.
I mean, if you look at the schedule, you got Wisconsin this weekend, then you got Georgia at home, South Carolina at Tennessee, Missouri at LSU, Mercer at Oklahoma, and Auburn. That's not an easy run. My guess is they'll lose at least 2.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm looking at some of these games last week and this week, and I know now why all those damn coaches didn't want to go to a 9-game schedule yet. I mean, we're going into week 3, and I think there are only 3 games matching up SEC opponents this week. I may be wrong, but I think there's only 3. So it's just I think when they do go to that 9-game, it's going to separate the boys from the men.
Well, you've got 6. Nathan, I'll let you go in a second, but you got 6 of the top 7 teams in the AP poll are SEC programs.
Yeah, I mean that's hard. That's why I tell you, South Carolina, they've got some players now. I think he's done a good job with the high schools and the portal. He's got about 10 players on that team who can play for anybody now, and it's starting to show up. So they're going to beat some people people don't think they're going to beat. They're going to get some surprise wins this year. On the other hand, they're not consistent enough, I don't think, to win big games consistently. But they've got some dangerous players, and what they did to Kentucky, watch out for this LSU matchup, because what Carolina can really do now, they can rush the passer. They've got some kids even inside, and they've got 2 edge kids that can rush the passer on anybody. And LSU has not yet found a good solid running game, and Nussmeier's not very mobile, and it's going to look a little bit like Kentucky if they don't get the running game going.
Yeah, and LSU lost Emory to a torn ACL last week. Yeah, I was going to say, Ellis, I was going to give you your props. When we recorded a couple weeks ago, you said, watch out for South Carolina. It could be a surprise team. And I think that was another example of, hey, don't get caught up too much in one game. They almost lost, maybe should have lost at home to Old Dominion.
Yeah.
Didn't let that affect them too much. That game was not close against Kentucky. Kentucky had no shot offensively against South Carolina's defense. That was, I think, maybe one of the underrated teams of the week.
Yeah. It's getting more and more in college football. It's just not like pros. It's getting to the point in college football, if you don't have a quarterback that can escape pass rush when it comes, you're going to have a hard time unless you can just hammer the ball and run it. A kid like Vandegrift, he's probably a really good quarterback in a drop back scheme, but they can't protect him long enough for him to be effective downfield. They couldn't protect him long enough the other day to get anything off. And I don't see, as pros, they have different ways that they can negate that and sometimes be reasonably effective with an immobile quarterback. It's almost impossible to do it in college now.
Yeah, that's part of Auburn's question too. Is Free said it yesterday. Thorne is mobile, and he admitted their offensive line is not perfect. I don't know if they were as bad as things were made out to be. I think Thorne did hold on to the ball a little too long. But the backup, Hank Brown, he's got a really big arm, but I don't know if he's as mobile or as athletic as because Thorne kind of doesn't. I don't think gets enough credit for his ability to do that. So that's another factor you got to think about when people are telling you to bench your quarterback. It'll be interesting to see what they do. I
think you look at Florida. Y'all already mentioned Florida. There was a difference in the mobility in the young kid that came in the game. And then, of course, we've already talked about it. But Milroe, when he really has a good game, about a third of his yardage is with his feet. It wasn't the other day. And then, of course, Kentucky, I don't know if their backup's good enough or not, but he's got to be more mobile than Vandegrift. And as of right now, they can't protect him. LSU, Nussmeier's a little bit more mobile than Vandegrift, but he's not a mobile quarterback. So they may struggle in Columbia.
Ellis, before we close out, give us, I got 2 questions. Number one, we talked about Florida. Florida State struggled. Miami looks a little bit better this year. But how can you have 3 programs in that state and they all seem to be, struggling to an extent. I remember when back in the 90s, they were all good. Now, Florida State seems to have, after having a really good year last year, they seem to have really, really fallen off. And then obviously look at Florida. I mean, they may not even make a bowl game. So,
yeah. Well, first of all, look at their rosters, and they're not recruiting the state of Florida that much. So the old adage, if you're in Texas or Florida, in Georgia or California, how could you not have a great football team with all the recruiting demographics? Well, half their roster are transfers, portal guys. But it looks like, for example, a lot of people criticize Dabo because he does not use the portal as much as he needs to. And then but nobody ever talks about the problem. Like Florida State right now has got an issue. They bought a defensive line, and those kids aren't playing right now. Now, I don't know if they misevaluated or if they're just not that happy about being where they are, just wanted a good situation financially. But they've had their butt kicked up front 2 weeks in a row now by Georgia Tech and Boston College. And I think those two teams are very well coached, and their head coaches have always had that philosophy of good, strong, physical running games and play action off of it, et cetera. And they're going to be more physical every week. But they don't have the kind of players that Florida State has talent-wise. But they got their butt kicked now 2 weeks in a row up front. Florida, we've already talked that. We beat that to death. And I think, again, they inherit a situation that's not really in a good situation, morale and talent. And you better have some really good infusion of players immediately, or you can't get it turned quick enough. Now, Miami, I haven't seen them a lot, but what I have seen of them, they're a good football team. And they've got a little toughness to them, and they've got enough talent. I'll be shocked if they're not, in the playoffs at the end. If the ACC gets 2 teams in, I'll be shocked if they're not one of them. I get your point. They're not like it used to be. But 25 years ago, it was all high school recruiting, and they had tremendous advantages. Now, also, you've got group of 5 teams playing football in Florida now that didn't play back then. And also, you got the portal. And I think, everybody in America goes to Florida to recruit. And so they go down and take a little bit of their talent out of there too.
Before we let you go, give us your top 3 in the SEC. I was reading a couple of stories yesterday. I think both the stories I read, they had Georgia, Texas, and Tennessee as their top 3 in the SEC. What's your pick?
Well, it's hard for me at this point. It's hard for me to separate 4, and that includes Ole Miss. I think Texas is the best football team, and if they hadn't lost their great running backs, they lost 2 backs, I think, in the preseason. But they don't have a donkey lined up there now, but they don't have the talent and the depth right there, so that could come around. But they can score better than Georgia can. I think Georgia's got a really good team, but they don't have the offensive firepower they had last year and the year before. Defensively, they look like they're just as good, and they did just completely stymie what I think is a pretty good Clemson football team. And Clemson's scheme is more of a finesse, skill type approach, and that don't work against Georgia. But I think Georgia's going to get challenged a little bit more as they go with more physical type approaches. But I say Texas and then Georgia and then Tennessee and then Ole Miss. And the reason I put Tennessee above Ole Miss, maybe not, maybe I hadn't seen enough of Ole Miss yet, but Tennessee's legit on defense now. They're really dangerous on offense like always, but they seem to have a really legit defense this year. And so that's the way I would line them up right now.
Well, Ellis, we appreciate you hopping on as always. I do wonder where Vanderbilt fits in there right now. They're one of the teams that's hopped on pretty quickly here at the beginning of the year.
Next time I'll tell my yard guy not to come around here while we're trying to record.
That's all right. We'll just have to have him on the show too. We'll have to have him pop inside, give his SEC standings. Well, thank y'all so much for tuning in. Appreciate Ellis as always, and we'll talk to y'all soon.